The air was thick, heavy with the stench of death and decay. It was as though the tomb had been sealed not to protect the living from the dead, but to contain something far more malevolent. Marcus took a step back, his face pale and drawn. "This place that's wrong. We need to leave." Before Sophie could respond, a gust of wind howled through the corridor, icy and foul, snuffing out the light. For a moment, there was only darkness, total, suffocating darkness that pressed against her like a living thing. Sophie fumbled for the flashlight, her heart pounding in her chest, but when she clicked it on, Marcus was gone. "Marcus?" Her voice echoed off the walls, distorted, twisted. The statues seemed closer now, their hollow eyes watching her with something more than just malice. They seemed hungry, desperate. A whisper, faint at first, slithered through the darkness. It grew louder, more insistent, until it became a cacophony of voices, each one speaking in a language Sophie didn't understand, yet somehow recognized. They spoke to her, not in words, but in feelings, despair, hopelessness, terror. They clawed at her mind, pulling her deeper into the tomb's grip. Sophie's breath quickened, her chest tightening with fear. The air grew colder, the walls closing in on her. Shadows flickered at the edges of her vision, darting between the statues, moving closer, closer. And then she saw him, Marcus, or what was left of him. He stood at the far end of the corridor, his body twisted and gaunt, his face a mask of terror. His eyes were gone, replaced by empty black sockets, and from his mouth poured the same whispers that filled the tomb. He moved toward her in jerky, unnatural movements, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. Sophie stumbled back, her hand brushing against something cold and wet. She looked down to see the floor, no longer solid stone, but slick with black ichor that oozed from the walls, pooling at her feet. The statues began to move, their stone limbs creaking and groaning as they stepped down from their pedestals, their mouths opening wider, wider still, until they seemed to tear at the edges. She turned and ran, the beam of her flashlight bouncing wildly off the walls. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, filling her mind with the weight of countless souls lost to the tomb. The statues closed in, their hollow eyes locked on her, their mouths gaping open as though they were trying to devour her very soul. Sophie burst into a vast chamber at the heart of the tomb, her breath ragged and her legs trembling with exhaustion. The room was massive, its walls lined with more of the grotesque statues, all of them turned toward a single object at the center, a stone pedestal. Atop it rested a glowing artifact, pulsing with a sickly green light that seemed to breathe with the same eerie rhythm as the whispers that filled the air. The moment her eyes landed on the artifact, the whispers intensified, louder now, as if they were screaming directly into her mind. It was calling to her, drawing her toward it with an irresistible force. Sophie felt her body moving on its own, her hand reaching out despite the terror that gripped her heart. She tried to resist, but it was like her body no longer belonged to her. It was the tomb's now, the curse working its way through her flesh. Behind her, the statues moved in unison, closing in on her, their hollow mouths stretching impossibly wide, their skeletal hands outstretched. Marcus, now a twisted, inhuman puppet of the tomb's dark magic, stood at the entrance, his eyes black pits, his mouth still pouring out the terrible whispers that had consumed him. Sophie's hand hovered over the artifact, her fingers trembling. She could feel its power radiating through the air, pulsing with ancient malice. And then, just as her fingertips brushed against its surface, she heard it, a voice different from the others. Clear, sharp. It cut through the whispers like a blade, ringing in her ears with a single, desperate command. Destroy it. The moment the words reached her, Sophie's body lurched forward, and in a single desperate motion, she grabbed the artifact and hurled it to the ground. The artifact shattered into 1,000 pieces, the green light exploding outward in a blinding flash. The tomb trembled, the floor beneath her feet splitting open with a deafening crack. The statues froze, their stone faces locked in eternal expressions of horror. The whispers stopped, replaced by a deep, guttural roar that echoed from the depths of the earth itself. Sophie fell to her knees, gasping for breath. The air around her seemed to collapse, growing heavy and thick, pressing down on her like a weight. She tried to move, to stand, but her body wouldn't respond. It felt as though the tomb was draining her, pulling the life from her bones, feeding on her very soul. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the trembling stopped. The statues were still, their grotesque forms frozen once again in place. The darkness that had filled the tomb seemed to lift, retreating back into the shadows where it had come from. The silence that followed was thick, oppressive, but somehow it felt final. When Sophie opened her eyes, she was no longer inside the tomb. She stood at its entrance, the massive stone door now wide open, allowing a sliver of sunlight to stream in. The jungle outside was calm, peaceful, the oppressive atmosphere gone as if the tomb had never existed. She stepped outside, her legs shaking with exhaustion. The sunlight felt wrong, too bright, too warm. It did nothing to chase away the cold that had settled deep inside her, a cold that seemed to cling to her very bones. As she walked through the jungle, she noticed the silence. The birds, the insects, even the wind through the trees. It was all gone, as if the world had fallen into a deep, unnatural stillness. And then she heard it, the faintest sound, barely audible at first, like a breath of wind. The whispering. Her heart sank as the sound grew louder, curling around her like a cold mist. She tried to ignore it, to push it away, but it was inside her now, burrowing deeper into her mind with every step. The voices were different, not the incoherent babble of the tomb, but familiar. Soft, beckoning. Sophie paused, her hand trembling as she reached up to touch her face. Her skin felt cold, too cold. Her fingers brushed against her eyes, and her stomach twisted with horror as she realized what was happening. Her eyes, they were gone. Empty sockets stared out at the jungle, just like Marcus's. Just like the statues. Sophie tried to scream, but no sound came out. The voices drowned everything now, their whispers filling her mind, growing louder, more insistent, until they were all she could hear. She fell to her knees, the jungle spinning around her as the last remnants of her sanity slipped away. And in the distance, hidden deep within the shadows of the jungle, the tomb's entrance sealed itself shut. The ancient curse, quiet once more, patiently awaited its next victim.